Evening. It's great to see everyone here tonight. Thank you so much for coming. It is a great honor and privilege for me tonight to get to introduce one of my human rights heroes, a man who has been extremely influential in, honestly, my life trajectory. So he published one of the very first books on contemporary slavery called Disposable People in the year 1997, which was the year I graduated from high school. And it was through him that him and another, modern day abolitionist that I first learned that slavery still existed in the 20th. At that time, it was still the 20th century, and it genuinely changed my life, and it changed the trajectory of my life. And so it is truly a privilege and an honor to be able to introduce tonight Dr. Kevin Bales, who is the foremost global scholar on human trafficking. He has some great, interesting, and exciting things to share with you tonight that I think could leave us very hopeful for the future. So let me just quickly read a very short bio of his, because no, not everybody's heard it, Kevin. Which is the great thing about him. He doesn't even know how great he really is. It's a short bio. His real bio, you can go to kevinbales.net and read the whole thing. It's quite long because his list of accomplishments is quite long. But Dr. Kevin Bales is a professor of contemporary slavery and research director of the Rights Lab at the University of Nottingham in the UK. He was co-founder of Free the Slaves and co-author of the Global Slavery Index. He has written over 8 books on human trafficking, including his most recent book, Blood and Earth, Modern Slavery, Ecocide, and the Secret to Saving the World, which explores the environmental impact of human trafficking. He serves on the board of directors for several global anti-slavery organizations, and one of my favorite things about him is that he's a champion for elevating survivor leadership in the global fight against slavery. So please join me in a warm welcome for Dr. Kevin Bales.
Thank you, Vanessa. It's, I love her intros because they're actually all about her. Have you noticed that? It's like, when I was a little girl, and then I was homecoming queen in high school, and then I read this book, and, it made me into a better person. I was like, but that's great, so I should just reintroduce you. Yeah, I should reintroduce you. We're close enough friends I can kid her like that. Maybe not after this, but now. Okay. So, do you need the mic a little? Am I? Well, you're too tall. Yeah. Do you want me to? Is that better? No? Still? Now? Are you in the back? Am I getting there now? Okay. I'll try to stay on the mic, because if the room's that big, I'll try to stay right on the mic. So, yeah, I do want to give you a bit of a hopeful talk. It's going to be not a short little talk, but it's going to be, I think, a happy talk, because this is not one of the talks about, here's this terrible thing happening over here, and here's another sad story about this person over there. This is a talk about unlocking the science of slavery. This is about the breakthroughs that we've been achieving, not just in the Rights Lab at the University of Nottingham, and I'll explain that the Rights Lab is about 2.5 years old now. It's fundamentally a research institute, but we have over 120 researchers, all focusing on modern slavery. And they're focusing on it from about 20 different disciplines. And you'll be able to see what happens, and enjoy, I hope as much as I do, what happens when you bring great minds from different areas of work in the world and bring them together and get them all focusing on the same problem. And suddenly things begin to change, and certainly things begin to break through. So that's what I want to talk to you about. I'm going to give you a series of examples about what's happening, and I think so much of it is good news. The first thing is, though, I'll back up and do a tiny bit of history here. Science and technology have always served slavery. Now, I know you don't tend not to think about it that way, but I'm going to give you a couple of examples. In fact, if you look at the history of science and the history of slavery, all the way back to the very first written records in human existence in Sumerian cuneiform, what you discover is that the very first information technology, which was called writing symbols that stood for words on a clay tablet, included extensively the records of slaves taken, slaves sold, slaves captured, slaves killed. In fact, that's one of the reasons that we know slavery is in fact prehistoric, because at the very beginning of human written records, when written human history begins, that history on those very first records are the details of enslavement. And you can see here the very earliest cuneiform symbols from 3000 BC, so 5,000 years ago, and you can see the symbol for woman, and you can see the symbol for man, and then you can see the symbol for woman slave, female slave. And in fact, when I was taught a little bit about this by someone who's a true ancient history scholar, he said, the very first symbol for slave was mountain person, mountain man, mountain woman, because if you can read the rest of the cuneiform, it'll say, and we left our space in Mesopotamia, went up into the mountain to harvest the slave animals that we could bring back to put into the farms. So that's why slave woman is in fact mountain woman. Here's some Iron Age technology for slavery. The Roman Empire was fundamentally occurred during the Iron Age, and we think about the Iron Age as, hammers or something, but in fact some of the first artifacts made with this brand new amazing technology that transformed the planet Earth were shackles, chains, all the kinds of equipment that you would use to control slaves. And in fact, if you leap just a little bit further in time from there, I'll show you a slave capture and delivery system. Now, it looks like a Viking ship. It is a Viking ship, and while we think about Vikings as guys who drink beer with horn hats on or something like that, the truth is that the Vikings established one of the greatest slave trading empires in human history. These ships carried slaves up and down rivers, across oceans. That when they were sort of blitzkrieg ships, they could roll up to a coastal town. The warriors could jump out, grab all the people they wanted, put them on the boats, and get away before any resistance was there. And if you go back to the early medieval records, you find, and the Vikings came to Dublin, and they left with about 2,000 women, which is why today, if you look at the genetics, if you do what's that one, like one of the genetic tests of the population of Iceland, the men are 20% Celtic or Irish, and the women are 60% Celtic or Irish, even today, in terms of their genetics loadings. Now, if slavery has been served by science and technology and by that kind of creativity of science for all these millennia, isn't it about time, and isn't it good that we can begin to take those same tools and direct them to the eradication of slavery, that we can get them to serve freedom? This is a little thing that I just put up because it's really nerdy, but I'm really happy because for many, many years, lots of us have been trying to get the world's data holders to share their data on slavery, to get the CIA to talk to the MI5 in the UK, to get different governments to work with each other to share the information they have about slavery. Because how can we get a handle on it until we get the knowledge about it? And this is last October, just gone, an agreement was reached for global data sharing on the situation of trafficking and slavery. Now, I get it. I'm one of those nerdy guys who gets really excited on data sharing, but so I thought I'd just get this out of the way right away. One that's a little more accessible is all the things that's been happening within the Rights Lab in terms of using satellites to find slavery. It started when, in the process of working on my book, Blood and Earth, I was in Bangladesh, and I was working in the Sundarbans UNESCO World Heritage Site. Now, the Sundarbans UNESCO World Heritage Site is at the bottom of Bangladesh. It's the world's largest mangrove forest. It's a pristine and untouched forest. It's the home of a whole lot of very important endangered species. It's also the largest carbon sink in Asia. And you know, a carbon sink is where you have so many trees, like the Amazon basin, that it literally sucks the carbon out of the air. It's one of the things that's helping in the whole situation of climate change. So it's an important, protected, absolutely protected area. Nothing's supposed to be there except the trees and the endangered species. But if you look at this picture, this is one that I picked up before we started our satellite work. I just took this off Google Earth, and I thought, I've been down in the Sundarbans. I was around this part of the islands in a boat. I saw these fish processing camps where I was told and then observed that their child slaves were being used. And I thought at the time I was there, I bet I could see these in a satellite. So I looked and I found it. You can see what the Sundarbans are supposed to look like on the right, but on the left, something else is happening. And you can see all those little lines. They look like little buildings or sheds or shacks or something. They're not. They're actually drying racks. And here you see two children who are enslaved. They've been tricked and taken down there and enslaved in the processing camp. And this is what they do. They take almost only children into these camps because they're easier to control. Notice that in the back, do you see the racks that go up in the distance, the racks that go up higher? Well, a very brave photographer I know took this picture of a modern slave driver beating children to make them work harder and faster on the drying racks. This is a horrific situation, but it's also driven by the fact that where does this fish go? Dried fish like this goes into things like cat food that actually reaches North America. And the other thing is that usually linked to these, there'll be a shrimp farm as well where they harvest shrimp and so forth. But the crucial thing here is that after I was able to write about it and talk to children who'd been freed from slavery in the camps and come to understand the horrific situation there, I was then able to come back to the lab and say, I think we can see these from space. And for the first time, we opened this up as a project and put literally a PhD student on it for a month. And by the end of that month, we had discovered 5 new fish processing camps stocked with child slaves from space that no one knew about, except the criminals who were running them, and probably some of the corrupt government officials. It was, and what's more, which I didn't quite even grasp this until they showed it to me, satellite imagery now goes back about 20 to 30 years. We've had satellites up that long. So they said, not only can I show you 5 camps you didn't know about, but I can show you where all the camps used to be and how they move and which directions they went and how global warming has caused sea level rises to push the camps into other areas. It was a breakthrough. It wasn't just finding a problem of a single crime in a single camp. Suddenly we know the patterns, we know the directions, we know which way to go. We then said, this satellite stuff's working out pretty well. So we said, if we're going to work on this really hard, we'll make the students do all the work for free, right? Okay. Sort of. But you all know about crowdsourcing, right? There's a crowdsourcing science site called Zooniverse, and you can see it down there somewhere in the corner. It says Zooniverse. Zooniverse has been used in the past to use particularly university students to look at galaxies and to classify galaxies in the universe and so forth. We said to the great crowd out there, most of them university students, could you help us identify brick kilns in South Asia? Brick kilns, we know, are sites with a very high likelihood of the use of enslaved families. So we said, but one of the things that, if you asked the questions a little while ago, how many brick kilns are they? Nobody knew. Where are they all exactly? Well, if you happen to live nearby, you might know where it was, but in terms of any kind of listing or mapping, no one knew where all the kilns were, or which kilns were active and which kilns weren't. So we set up a crowdsourcing thing to help students learn how to identify the kilns in satellite images. And they would see a screen like this. And you can see little ovals, these little tiny ovals, that they would learn, okay, so that's what a brick kiln looks like. And when we go over, when you have 1,000 young people or old people looking at the images, and they're picking these out, what they're doing is sweeping over the whole part of India, Nepal, Pakistan. And of course, the way crowdsourcing works is that you don't just do it once, you maybe have 10 to 20 of the individuals independently looking, so that the computer behind them is getting it, okay, so this is definitely one because 10 people have agreed that this is definitely a kiln. This is what it looks like when you're on your screen, you're picking out those brick kilns. Because I had worked on slavery and brick kilns in the past, I had been careful to bring the team a lot of pictures from ground level so you could understand what it looked like at ground level as well as from above. But of course, was it just the students doing the work? Well, not exactly, because when you have a crowdsource, you don't have to just train the students, because the students learn pretty quickly. But the students' actions, by identifying the kilns over and over and over again, can teach a machine. It's fundamental machine learning. And the next step then is AI. So the students in the crowdsource identified, I don't know how many, maybe 10%, maybe 20% of all the brick kilns in the brick belt. But by the time they had reached that level, the machine learning had kicked in, and the AI, as we call it, it's really just a bunch of algorithms, but anyway, the AI, it sounds more like robotic or something, clicked and said, wait, I can do this now. And before we knew it, we had every single brick kiln in India, Pakistan, and Nepal, and over into China identified, some 48,000 of them, with the precise location. Now we're going back and using different filters to separate the live ones from the ones that are not being used. And also loading them into the maps that have to do with the geographical and governmental spaces. Now, does this solve the slavery in them? No. But what it does do is it tells us precisely where we've got to go. So we've got a GPS position for every single brick kiln. We work with groups on the ground. They're able to check and see what's going on in each one. Not every single brick kiln has slave labor, but as I say, it's a very high likelihood. So it's a step. It's a step along that way. We also have been working on the economics of slavery and trying to go further with this. And in fact, just over at SMU in the week, we were talking about the economics of slavery and new projects that could be done to help us unpick that part of slavery. Because slavery is, after all, global slavery, global trafficking, it's an economic enterprise. It's not only economic, because people engage in it for cultural reasons, sexist reasons, misogynist reasons, racist reasons, all of these things are part of the motivators, but at the end of the day, usually there's a profit to be made. The one thing that's important that we've now made pretty clear, and a lot of people have come to understand about the situation of trafficking and enslavement today, though, is that there's been this profound collapse in the cost of acquiring human beings into trafficking and into slavery. It looks like this. Oh, that's supposed to be a film. Okay, I'm going to try. Oh, it worked when we tested it. I'm going to back it up one. So these lads live in Nepal. They've been tricked away from their parents. Their parents were told that if they came and worked for this man, they'd be given some good money and a chance at schooling. But then, of course, they were removed to a completely different part of Nepal, and they were used as donkeys, basically. Their job is to carry very heavy stones on their backs. There are very few roads in Nepal, so they have to go up and down the mountainsides and carry these stones on their back. I use them as an example because they are a perfect example of the disposability and the very low cost of people who are caught in slavery today. To acquire one of these children, I don't even say buy, I'll say acquire, what normally occurs is that the recruiter who takes them away from their parents says, and we can give you an advance on their wages, which is appealing to them, and they actually think they're doing a good thing for their sons, and they're given maybe $10 in local currency, maybe $10, maybe $5, maybe $10. So the cost of actually acquiring the child to work to haul the stone is, say, $10. The other demonstration of the disposability is that when they carry these weights, which are in fact greater than their own body weight often, and they're going down these rocky paths, and then they trip and they fall into the crevasse and they break a leg, the slaveholders go down and they take the stone but leave the kid, because it costs more to take them for medical care than it does to go to a village and offer an advance of another $10 for another child. Now, this is a difference to slavery in all of human history. It's only been in the last 50 to 60 years that the price of human beings, not either in markets or just in acquisition, has collapsed. A picture of that, a graph of that, looks like this. And I have it in my speaker's contract that I get at least two nerdy graphs per talk, so this is the second one. Fundamentally, if you look across slavery of the past and where we have really good records, I mean, we have slave sale records from ancient Rome, we have slave sale records from ancient Greece, and in the United States, in the Deep South, including Texas, we have phenomenally rich records of all of the buying and selling of slaves. If you take those numbers from those records, say from 1850, and you say, what was the average cost of an average slave in the past? Well, the average cost of an average slave, who would be a 19-year-old agricultural worker in 1850 in the Deep South, the average cost of that person would have been about $1,200 $1850. About $1,200 $1850 in 1850. What else could you buy in 1850 for $1,200? A house, 200 or 300 acres of land, maybe more depending on where you were. You could buy 6 oxen for $1,200, but when I say oxen, think tractor, right? Because that's what they had instead of tractors. People in slavery in the past were expensive. $1,200 in 1850 is about $40,000 to $45,000 in today's money, and that was for the average 19-year-old agricultural worker. It's why American insurance companies, a lot of them don't like to put this in their brochures of their history, but had enormous businesses insuring the slaves of the Confederacy, of the pre-Confederacy, of the Deep South. There was a lot of insurance going on because they were big investments, right? They were big investments. That collapse alters the necessary underpinnings of how slavery works. And that's why when I kind of worked all out and published about that in my first book, I'd called the book Disposable People, because I realized we'd moved from a world in which slaves were capital investments to being disposable inputs. No longer like a tractor, more like a styrofoam cup that you can crumple up and throw away when you're done using it. Using that fact, we begin to go much further into the economics of it. But I'm going to keep going because we don't want to get bogged down into economics, because that could go anywhere. We've had a real breakthrough in measurement. We now have an globally agreed methodology and globally agreed number. Again, this is the sort of nerdy bit, but the United Nations, the ILO, the International Organization of Migration, the Walk Free Foundation, which bankrolls the Global Slavery Index, have brought all the methodologists together, pooled their resources, and have come up with the number you saw here, of 40.3 million people in the world in slavery, as a conservative number, And that's an important and powerful number. I know it seems like just a big bunch of numbers, but it's an important and powerful number for 2 reasons. One, how do you solve a problem you can't measure? How do you know what you've got to do if you don't know where the people are who are in this situation and how many there might be? That's one reason, because policy and programs need metrics, even at the global level. But the other reason is because of the size of this number. You're looking at it and you may be thinking 40.3 million is a big number of people in slavery in the world. But I have to tell you, I see it the other way around. I look at this number and say 40.3 million people in the world in slavery in a global population of 7.6 billion means we now have the tiniest fraction of the global population ever enslaved. At no time in human history have there been this few people in slavery. And if there's $150 billion in annual turnover, according to the UN, from these 43.3 million slaves, we are now living in a world in which the economic input to our global economy is so minute from slavery, so fractional from slavery, that if we were to wipe out slavery tomorrow, we wouldn't notice it in the global economy. The criminals would have a bad day, but the price of nothing we buy would go up a penny. It's that fractional. And that's a difference. I know, I see frowns all around. It's like, wait a minute, I thought this was a big problem. We had to be really worried about this. We do, because in terms of moral and ethical and human damage and the stain of this on humanity, it's enormous. But the good news is it's a tiny enormous. It's in functionally, mathematically, a fraction. One that if we put our act together, we can actually deal with this. We are actually standing at a point in human history where slavery is standing on the edge of its own extinction. So small that with a hard enough push, maybe not gone forever, but certainly very dramatically reduced. We can talk about how that would come about too, because we have some really good ideas for that. I want to tell you about how we've begun to measure it in rich countries as well. One of the greatest problems we've had in the work on contemporary slavery and human trafficking is that while you can get decent measures of the amount of people who are trafficked and enslaved in poor countries, often by random sample surveys, in well-off countries like the United States, like the countries of Western Europe, there are so few, as mentioned before, there's so few in the population that you can't catch them. It's like if you spread them among millions and you've only got thousands, you can't make the net fine enough to catch those little tiny fish. And it was only 3 years ago that we tried out a new technique called multiple systems estimation. That's what that MSE is. It's a technique that we brought over from two areas of statistical work. One is the computations you do to figure out how many fish are in a lake, funnily enough. And secondly, the computations you do to figure out how many people got killed in a mass atrocity in the middle of a war zone, which is kind of like a churned up lake with dead fish. This is my second nerdy slide. This is just to show for the nerds in the audience the fundamental concepts of MSE. It's about working from overlapping lists, or if it's fish, overlapping nets, and marking out those and extrapolating, but based on a formula, what the size of the lake is or what the size of the universe is. So when you've heard people on the radio say, the United Nations says that in the past month in Syria, there have been 14,000 people killed in central Syria, they didn't count them. That was the Human Rights Data Analysis Group performing a multiple systems estimation for that month in that country. We've now done this for the UK. So while we know we have 2,500 actual known cases of people in slavery in the UK, once known to the police, we know that we are pulling that from a pool of somewhere between 11 and 13,000 people in slavery in the country. It's never been done in the United States, except in the city of New Orleans, where I had a research team and we did it. That was the only place where we could get enough cooperation from city government to make it happen. In the city of New Orleans, We know there's about 200 and 300 people, known cases, but the estimations tells us there's probably 1,000 people trafficked and enslaved in New Orleans. About. The question has to be then, if MSC, if this works in cities and states and regions and whole countries, come on, Texas, what y'all waiting for? Right? If you know the size and shape of it, you can do something about it. So, of course, we're chit-chatting and flirting with the governor's office and doing what we can. But I'll tell you what, the governor of Utah is interested too. Who knows who's going to get to be the first state in the union to demonstrate this technique and be like the hero state. Okay. We've got some other interesting breakthroughs that have to do with computation, but some of these are actually computational linguistics. Corpus linguistics is about the application of very large data processing applied to collections of millions of words. Millions of words. It's hard, I have to admit, even for me, because I've never worked before in corpus linguistics. I made a little word cloud. Everybody's seen word clouds on the web, right? I made this word cloud using some web-based word cloud generator, but I did make it out of about 30,000 words directly from the mouths of slavery survivors in their own narratives, telling their own stories. So this word cloud, for example, is a word cloud of the thoughts and voices and ideas that have come from recent survivors of enslavement. So in a sense, corpus linguistics, in its most simple metaphor, is like a word cloud, but it's actually much more than that. It's kind of a supercharged word cloud. And we use it to explore narratives. What have we learned about the lived experience of slavery from this kind of computation? Well, since it's a way to look into literally hundreds of minds in terms of how they've expressed themselves, we've noticed that, and it would be linguistic, we've noticed that survivors rarely use the future tense. And if they talk in any way about the future, they immediately follow it by a sudden movement to the past tense. They tend to say me, not I. They tend to see themselves as an object, not a subject. And then that flows on to some other things that we've been learning from talking to people about their narratives, and more bringing survivors into not as subjects of scientific object, but as participants and scholars and scientists themselves. And one of the most powerful things that's come out of this corpus linguistic analysis is this. The lived experience of slavery, which you can't understand unless you've lived the experience of slavery, has a couple of key features. One is atemporality. And what that means is that when you are in a situation under the total control of another person, they don't want you to think or be or in any way allude to a past or a future. They want you to exist in a permanent, total present of obedience and control. And as we talked about this and learned this from survivor scholars, and they would explain to us, yes, you see, when we were in that situation, if you thought about the future, if you projected yourself in any way, if you said, I'd like to go and do that, you'd be slapped, you'd be hit, you'd be kicked, you'd be starved. If you said, I want to go back to where I was, I want to be like it was when I was free, you'd be beaten, you'd be oppressed. You learned that if you went forward or back, future or past, you suffered pain, and in the present of total obedience, you had the least pain. So you stayed in the present of total obedience. And it was interesting, we'd say, this is phenomenal. We've never grasped this. I've worked in this field for decades, and I had never twigged this, understood this. And truly, saying then to people who are survivors of slavery, who are also scholars, saying, why haven't you explained this to us before? And they said, nobody ever asked us, and when we tried, they didn't believe us. Right. But it's all starting to come through now. We're starting to understand how that works. How that lived experience is something. It's fascinating when you step back and say, every law against slavery in the world, almost every book about slavery in the history of the world, all of those things, every sermon preached about it in the world, almost all of them, except for the tiniest fraction, have all been written or spoken by people who've never been in slavery. Only that tiny handful, the Frederick Douglasses of the world, who have tried to tell us these things. Right? This leads to what we call an epistemology of survival. That's not my phrase. That's the phrase of Min Dang, who's a survivor scholar, who said, epistemology, that's a big word, and I saw these like, what's that? Epistemology is fundamentally just how you know what you know. How do you think about how you know what you know? What's your perspective or your standpoint for understanding something as opposed to her standpoint facing this way, right? And survivors of slavery are telling us, we're now beginning to able to explain to you the true worldview of the reality of a person who's caught up in trafficking and slavery, the lived reality of it. We're only just opening that door, and I'm very excited because I think it's going to teach us a lot about how best to befriend and help and work with and learn from people who have been in that situation. We're having an interesting breakthrough along the lines of how we put all of these types of tools together. This next example has some satellite work, some on-the-ground data, a bit of time series, measurement of discrete variables like murder, and you put it all together and it looks a little funny, but I'll explain what it is. It looks like this. So this is not Brazil, this is the Amazon. In fact, if you look up at the top, you see a purple thing that looks like a river. That's the Amazon River, right? And the green parts of this map, this is all based on satellite imagery and then filled in according to what's actually on the ground. The green parts of this map are parts, and this is not Brazil, this is the Amazon basin, part of Brazil, and mostly the southern Amazon basin. So the green parts of this map are the parts of the great Amazon forest, the lungs of the planet, as it's known. This is the great Amazon forest. The green parts are the parts that are still forest, the parts that haven't been cut. The yellow parts of this map are the parts of the Amazon protected, absolutely protected Amazon forest, which should never have been cut, but have been cut. So all the yellow parts are the bits that have been illegally cut of the Amazon forest. Now the reason why we're talking about this in terms of trafficking and slavery is it's not bulldozers that are used to destroy the Amazon. It's enslaved workers with axes. And you can see when you look at the yellow bits how they often follow what would be roads. So long thin lines of yellow, or little clusters of yellow. And if you look sort of just inside the smallest of the rings, you'll see a little yellow blotch when almost everything else is green. And you'll see inside that blotch a big blue dot, and I think it's about 12 red dots. Well, a big blue dot tells us that there's at least 50 known cases in that little area of enslavement. And each one of the red dots is a murder. Now, I have to tell you, having worked in the Amazon in this situation, for every murder you know about, there's probably 5 you don't, because you bury people in the forest, you just never know where they go. Likewise with the cases of enslavement, because people are enslaved, they've worked very, very hard, and what normally happens is they just get dumped in the forest. Some of them make it out, some of them don't. So there's a lot of data lost. But then we can, and the purple parts are at the bottom those are the parts of land which were never protected, and they're just farmland or whatever, so we're not worried about those as much. But you can see here over time, by looking at the red lines, how really the scythe of violation, of murder and enslavement is cutting into the basin, and how it's progressing along, pushing along and bringing into the lungs of the planet, the great protector that we have against climate change. And I have to say, the situation's only going to get worse now under the new government in Brazil, who've said, we're thinking about just selling off the whole Amazon so that we can get rid of it and sell it to our friends to cut. But that kind of information allows us to then link in new ways by looking at murder and slavery and deforestation and climate change and CO2 emissions and so forth together to begin to tie these issues together. If contemporary slavery and trafficking was once a single issue, we now understand it's not. It's not something you can separate out. It's something linked to a whole lot of other things like environmental protections. Now here's another little graph. It's just a scatter plot, but it's fundamentally saying one of the things, if you look across the planet and you have an EPI, which is an environmental protection score, is low in your country, you will also have high slavery. High environmental protections, low slavery. That these things are at the global level, they're linked and correlated and significantly so. But the dots don't tell the story like this factoid does. Turns out that if you measure CO2 emissions that are generated by slave-based activity, trafficking and slavery-based activity, deforestation, brick kilns, other types of mining, charcoal making, and then you add up how that all comes together as a part of a global economy, you get to this point where you say, well, let's see, if we were to think of slavery as if it were not 40.3 million people spread all over the planet, but 40.3 million in a single country. So if slavery were a country, or if it were a U.S. state, but if it were a country. So if slavery were a country, it would have the same population of Algeria, or it'd be a little bit larger, I think, than California, if it were an American state, 40.3 million. I can't remember how many people are in California. I think it's a little under that. If it were a country, it would have, at $150 billion a year, it would have the gross domestic product, the GDP, of Bulgaria. Or, and don't tell me how they do this blows my mind, Kansas. I don't know what they're doing in Kansas to make 150 billion turnover a year. I think there's an investigation right there. I don't know what that's about. I grew up next to Kansas. It's like there was nothing happening over there. We had an oil refinery. They had like grass. Anyway, the point is, if slavery were a country, it would be a small, poor country. But if slavery were a country, it would be the third largest emitter of CO2 in the world after China and the United States. That's both horrible and wonderful. It's a bit like the figures about how many people are in slavery. It's a huge number, but it turns out it's a small number. Here it's a huge number, but why does it make me feel hopeful to see that the products of enslavement is the third largest emitter of CO2 in the world? Because whether or not you think there is such a thing as climate change, whether or not you think environmental protections are important, you will almost always agree that slavery is wrong, and we know that slavery is illegal in every country in the world and that it's illegal at all international levels as well. In other words, if we were trying to reduce all the gas-guzzling cars of China and the United States, we'd have to do it almost one by one. It'd be a really tough job. And it wouldn't, at this point, be legal. But if we wanted to remove slaves from situations where they are generating CO2, it's perfectly legal. And in fact, it's encouraged. We're supposed to enforce the law around the world. What if resources were put in the direction of those particular types of slavery and trafficking, though it should go to all of them, of course, right? Well, if there was a dramatic alteration in how many people were drawn just from those types of slavery that cut forests and make bricks and charcoal and so forth, you could probably, within 5 or 6 years, maybe 10 years, see a diminution in those emissions. So they wouldn't put 2.54 billion tons of CO2 in the world. That would slow. What would that do to the curve of carbon increasing in the atmosphere? It would probably level it out. If the people who had been caught up and enslaved to do the environmentally destructive work were then paid, perhaps from carbon credits on the international carbon credit market, to replant the forests that they had been forced illegally to cut, they would begin to sequester the carbon out of the air, not just fail to put the carbon up. They would begin pulling it down into the air, new forests, and it might even turn the trend downward so that CO2 would begin to reduce in the global atmosphere. That's why I think that's hopeful. That's why I think once we understand the relationships of these things at the global economic, environmental, technical way, connections, we can do something about it. We've been having quite an interesting time examining conflict and religion and terrorism and understanding how they fit together with enslavement and trafficking. Now, I appreciate most of you probably don't read Dabiq. This is the online English magazine of ISIS. And I'll tell you, you can just go online and read this, but I will tell you, if you go online and read it, you might get a call or a visit, because most of the intelligence agencies monitor who reads Dabiq. And I told the intelligence, I had a little message and said, and I explained what we were doing. They were like, okay, you can look, but not too much, right? But anyway, so this is the ISIS magazine from a little while ago. But what I just pointed out there is to note the key article in that issue of Dabiq. It's the rise of slavery, right? It's about bringing back slavery, about why under the twisted and deformed ideological interpretation of Islam created by ISIS, slavery becomes a good thing. And that particular article, which is interminably boring to read, but is fundamentally this wacko, justification for why it's okay for ISIS to enslave people. Now we've got some newly recovered, we have a terrorist unit within the lab, a small group, who have now been able to get their hands on brand new recovered internal records from northern Iraq that had been abandoned by ISIS when they were pushed out of one zone, that have shown that ISIS in 2014 was making $2 million a day from the trafficking of slaves. They were funding terrorism and military action on the back of slave labor. Well, they'd already set up the justification, right? They'd already published the reasons why it was okay to do this. They'd already commodified captured people. The one flaw in their economics is that they tend to kill men but enslave women, where they might make even more if they enslave men as well. And I was astounded when my experts were reading through the Arabic and were saying, oh yeah, well, so the man who's in charge of this is called the Minister of Spoils. It's just right out of the medieval period. We've been watching all of that and trying to understand and unpick that. And I have to say, one of the things is that the intelligence agencies and the military, certainly in the UK, have been saying, okay, this is interesting, because we know about the financing through oil. We didn't grasp how much money they were making through fundamentally slave trading. And now we're working with them about how do we crack that open. But we've also been saying, how does this fit to other types of conflict? If slavery can be that lucrative for an aggressive, violent group like ISIS, what about in other types of conflict? So we did a little experiment. We took all the wars, called the conflicts, between 1989 and 2016. I was surprised that there were 1,113 conflicts from the end of the Cold War till the end of 2016, but there were. And this is the way those are coded by the Uppsala Center on Conflict in Sweden, is that a conflict has at least 25 battle-related deaths in a one-year period and at least two sides fighting, right? So wait, 25 battle-related deaths, 2 years. So that could be Houston, I guess. Just in terms of the numbers. But leaving aside sorry, that was a cruel joke on Texas. Leaving that aside, we took all of those 1,113 conflicts, and we put workers on it, student workers. A lot of us worked to investigate every single one of those conflicts. Journalistic, academic writing, magazines, TV reports, locals, narratives of the people who lived there, interviews that we could get, people, diplomats in the countries, fundamentally to say, we know there was a conflict in this place from this time to this time. What can you tell us about different types of potential enslavement that occurred during that conflict? And then coded all that up. Now, we were doing that because we thought if a group like ISIS is using a lot and making a lot from the enslavement of people within the conflict, this may be a pattern that we can pick out. Guess what? It was a pattern so big it ran over us like a truck. Everywhere, it turned out, slavery and conflict were in this deadly dance. 87.5, basically 9 conflicts out of 10 had enslaved child soldiers. And you can read the rest. A third of the conflicts had enslavement into sexual exploitation or forced marriage, trafficking in 17%, and so forth, forced labor in about a quarter. It was everywhere, in huge numbers, across all of the conflicts. We're now pushing the data back from 1989 to 1946, and we'll even have a bigger picture of how tightly this linkage is between enslavement and conflict. We knew that when a conflict erupts, the rule of law collapses, and that when the rule of law collapses, people who have power, particularly weapons, can do whatever they like, and one of the things they like is taking control of other people. We understood that. We didn't know that the pattern was going to be so distinct. We didn't understand that, as we do now, because we had 1,113 points in our data, that once a conflict reached 1,000 battle deaths per year, the amount of enslavement increased very dramatically. That it seemed to be something that came with a mature, desperate conflict, more than just a bunch of skirmishing. That once it really got its ugly teeth into the people who were fighting it, that it became that way. And that it was going to occur especially not between governments, conflicts between governments, but conflicts between governments and internal opposition groups, when other states weren't intervening. Now these are very simple things that we've been finding, but these are things that, as far as we know, we never knew before. And now we want to push this along and see how much further we can go with that and get it. We know that when we get back to World War II, we understand the phenomenal extent of enslavement that went on in World War II. We know that there were more people enslaved, particularly by the Axis forces, than were killed in the Holocaust, by about another 20 to 30%. That's in the records that they've left behind. But we tended to think of that, like the Holocaust, as being an absurd exception, something beyond belief. It seems like it may not be that. So here we go. Here's what happens when we unlock this science. When I first started working in this field and we began to try to unpick just some of the hundreds of puzzles we faced about trafficking and slavery, we also found that so many people who were involved with it, with good reason, were highly emotive about it, because it's a heartbreaking thing. It's a thing that breaks your heart, and you can react to it emotively. And we had very simplistic ideas about these people are evil and they're bad and those people are good and we must rescue those pitiful girls, and it was disparate and it was disorganized. The groups weren't working together. But you start to think it through and you begin to work it out, and you realize the complexity. You stop being emotional all the time and you get logical. You get unified, you get organized, and that's when things start to change, and that's when we can begin to make things happen. Now, I've mostly been talking about what we've just found out. I want to show you where we're going now. Coming soon, We want to look at the brains and the epigenetics of people who have come through slavery. We have something all ready to go, which will be a matched comparison of probably 6 to 8 people who have been in slavery, and matched in terms of ethnicity, gender, age, and education levels who have not been in slavery, and looking at their brain imagery to see what it's about, and see what epigenetic changes have also occurred in their biochemistry. We know this is important because this kind of work's been done on Holocaust survivors and on certainly people who have been in combat, that kind of, and we know that once you have the brain imaging and the epigenetics, it can help you to tailor the therapeutic responses. Okay, if we can do that for people who have come out of enslavement and trafficking, all the better. I say this week's breakthrough because this slide and the one after it wasn't in this set until about 45 minutes ago, when I got an email from one of my colleagues who's now releasing some information that he's been collecting over the last couple of years, where he's been interviewing perpetrators of slavery and the people that they've enslaved who have just come away from their slavery. He's got matched pairs of masters and slaves. It's never been done in human history to sit down and draw out in interviews matched pairs of perpetrators of slaves and masters. So I made this pathetic little cartoony slide, but I just wanted to show you, what these people are saying to each other. And the distance between the conceptualization of reality that they have is fascinating, and I think as he develops, and we have, this is just two little examples from one dialogue. I think as we begin to explore this further, we're going to learn a great deal more. The slaveholder, these are direct quotes. He was saying, they always must remain under us, and we must remain above them. All the lower castes are mischievous, and they're starting to act out. This is how he was responding to their fight for freedom. And meanwhile, the person who had come out of freedom's saying, my landlord threatened me and asked me why did I file a case against him? And in those days, we were slaves. We were suppressed by the people. We used to listen according to their terms. That's why we don't want this life. And just one more example. This one I found shocking and telling. The master was just happily explaining in his interview with my friend Austin. He said, less and less of our boys are going to rape the lower caste women. We just run into problems when the women don't accept it. People just don't really care about each other anymore. I mean, what? Yeah. The worldview of the slaveholder is something you rarely, we project the worldview of the slaveholder in most novels or in most understanding. We don't hear it from their own mouths. And of course, in the same period of interview, the ex-slave was saying, this caste system that I'm in is unfair and wrong, and I fear I'll get beat if I try to enter the upper caste house, but we are human beings, and they are also human beings. It's a bad thing that these rules are here. You know what's, it's a powerful statement of the superiority of the inferior, right? Of the truth of the bottom pushed to the top. When the people who think they know everything and are the superior beings are saying, oh, we just can't rape them like they used to. I don't know why they don't like us anymore. Are then answered by people who talk of justice and right and logic. You begin to see why this slavery system will fall and how we can undermine it. Here we are in the true coming soon things. We're looking closely across the whole Anthropocene impact. We still live in the Neocene, but they're about to rename it the Anthropocene because so much is changing in the world because of human impact. And you can chart all those things. Not only does that curve that spins up to the right represent CO2 emissions and species extinction and the fall in the price of people in slavery and everything else, we want to understand if those curves keep continuing like that as we rush toward higher oceans and more CO2 and higher temperatures and weather changes and climate change. We want to try to predict and understand what that will do to increase the vulnerabilities of people to be caught up in situations of trafficking and slavery. Because we already know that in a number of countries around the world, desertification, flooding, and so forth are pushing poor, especially poor farmers and so forth, into those situations where they're much more likely, they've lost their livelihood, they've lost their land, they're much more likely to be caught up in that kind of exploitation. And you know, I'll just say that because I'm in North Texas. You know, my grandparents lost their farm and lost their business in the Depression in a Dust Bowl. And they got in a truck and became migrant farm workers and picked fruit, and my mom was a little girl picking cotton when she should have been in school. They were lucky that that was all the exploitation they had. We're not that far removed from that kind of change, and ought to be able to remember that. The other thing that's coming soon is we're beginning to measure more carefully and understand the phenomenal power of freedom as a dividend. The freedom dividend, the idea that we're measuring now longitudinally that shows how when people come to freedom out of slavery, particularly in communities which have had very high amounts of it, it's not just that they get free. The economy begins to spiral upward as you unleash the productivity and the creativity of the people who have been held down. When you get kids out of mines or farms and let them go to schools, and they get smart, things begin to happen, and people learn how to do better jobs. The things that we track just tend to all go positive. Sexual violence goes down, political participation goes up, medical care goes up, drinking goes down. I mean, it's very interesting. There's this enormous dividend. Now that's the one that we're not there yet. That's why I say it's coming soon. We want to be able to quantify what would the freedom dividend be if we were able to calculate it out into the different types of trafficking and slavery around the world and total it up. Because we think it's going to cost $23, $25 billion to get everybody in the world out of slavery. What if the dividend was 55 or 105? We don't know yet. But we want to get there and be able to say, you know what? This isn't a cost, this is a bargain, right? And maybe we'll get there too. All right, that's all I wanted to tell you about. I'm happy to take some questions, and I thank you very much. Long or short? Oh, okay. Do we have anyone who wants to ask a quick question? Oh, yes, I talk to her all the time. Yes, ma'am. So I'll repeat your question. She's asking, how is our data being used by businesses, if at all? And the answer is, in different ways. I mean, not a lot of businesses pull our data, but we actually know that most of the individual businesses, but we know that the big risk calculators, the big accounting firms which do risk reports for corporations like Thomson Reuters, they pull all of our, because we're academics, because we're scientists, we share all of our data. We make all of our data available to all of their scientists, which means that Thomson Reuters and Archer Daniel, and the big accounting firms, they just suck it all up too and use it to prepare their risk reports. Now we don't see those because those are private contracted things, but they all use it to help companies to think through where they might or might not want to invest or operate. We know that. We also do a lot of work at all levels. We have a whole team on supply chains. Recently, one of our colleagues had a tiny brainwave when he was walking past a car wash in Nottingham, in England. And because he saw, I think it was 7 or 8 young men washing a car, and he thought they didn't necessarily look like Englishmen. And he noticed it was 5 pounds to do the car wash, and he was noticing that it took them about 20 minutes to do the whole job. And he thought, there's no way you could pay minimum wage or anywhere near it if that's going as fast as I thought it was. So he took his 2 kids on the Saturday and gave them stopwatches and clipboards and had one of them timing the car washes, one of them counting the people, one of them watching the money change. And by the end of the day, he said, if they're paying them at all, it's going to be like 50 cents an hour, right? Because you can't have that many people do that many cars for that little money, which then became a formula which the police have taken over in Britain and are going around with their stopwatches. And then they're checking in and saying, we'd like to see everybody's papers, we'd like to talk to the owners, and so forth. So there's a lot of way that the data can spread out. What's another question? Yes, ma'am.
Sir, your research of the 40.3 million that you've identified as slaves essentially around the world, did you notice a disparity of the male to female breakdown of that number, or was it a pretty even spread?
It's a fairly even split, but I have to tell you that we don't have gender breakdown on all countries. So some of the estimation is much more reliable than others. Well, not much more reliable. Let me say it that way. If we're using multiple systems estimation, we can have gender breakdown. If we're using random sample surveys, we can have gender breakdown. But for the countries, at least half the countries in the world, we build their estimations through algorithms that extrapolate from other variables to what it should be if these other things apply, which are the things about that country. And that's gender neutral, right? Yes?
In my experience, it's been very difficult to convince corporate structures and governmental entities to save money that they haven't spent yet. So when you talk about the cost savings for ending slave ships, how do you expect to sell that to the power structures of the world?
I don't know if we have to sell it to corporations, but it would make sense to sell it to governments, because it's more of a legal issue at that point than it is a corporate issue. And I think the answer would be, this is a low-cost investment in economic growth, because you basically just have to pay law enforcement and social services at the rates that you're paying them now, but expand them a bit, not build a lot of factories, not build a lot of highways. I think you'd have to make the economic case for it. I appreciate what you're saying. And one of the things that we know, if you study the history of anti-slavery movements, you know, the first anti-slavery movement began in May 1787. It was the first human rights campaign in human history. And it achieved its aims in about 20 years, the end of the legal slave trade across the Atlantic in the British Empire. There are four anti-slavery movements in human history, and we're in the middle of the fourth one right now. But if you look at the history of business and government participation in all of those movements, what is clear is that they come to the table last. Activists lead, survivors lead, communities lead, churches lead, but the last people at the table are the politicians, and then they say, haven't we done brilliantly, as they take credit for passing a law, right, which was coming. I mean, it's harsh to say that, but that you look across all the countries in the world, and it's the same story over and over. Yes, sir.
So like we talked about Nepal a couple of times. So
Wait, say that once more. I'm going to repeat it.
so we talked about Nepal a couple of times. Yeah. So like Nepal is the 22nd poorest country in the world, and the economic opportunities from barely little to none. So my question is the question, like we talked about the moral and difficulty around slavery. Well, I don't particularly like to use the word slavery, and I have a word. So instead of like, if we know all this data that exists and what is happening, instead of working to block it, why can't we regulate?
Why can't we regulate slavery instead of end it?
So I don't like to say it is slavery because I have my own reason for it. So, for example, a parents is sending their children to work in city, in Nepal, for example. Like, they don't know where the son or daughter is going to be, but they are still doing it for very few sum of money.
That may not be slavery. But if it is slavery, it's slavery. And
So
we
it-
don't regulate slavery.
So when I say like let's regulate it, I mean it in a very different way. So like instead like if someone is sending their daughter or son to work with someone else, we can make them send him to school as well.
Yes. And that would be placement of a child, like an apprenticeship. Let me just, I hear what you're saying, and I do appreciate that in many parts of the world, and it was once very common in Western Europe and North America as well, there would be the sending of children off to work with relatives and work with other people because it was a normal pathway to life and to learning a job. Placement or apprenticeship, very common. Very common now in West Africa, very common in Nepal. That's a system which we know can actually work and can actually work without much damage to human beings. But we also know that that system has always in history been perverted. It's been subsumed and perverted by people who were fundamentally criminal and used that system to enslave people. It's funny that I'm going to talk about my own relatives twice, but when my ancestors came to America, they were sent here as convicts under a certain kind of contract that required them to work off their debt, in this case in North Carolina, right, before they could be freed. And it was fundamentally a placement system. Now the good news was my relatives worked it off, and then they were let go, and they got to farm for themselves. But it's also true, this is about 1740, 1750, it's also true that there were people who were sent over under exactly the same kind of indenture, it was called, and who were never released. They were kept until they died as slaves, even though that. So what I'm saying, that you can pervert systems of movement and mobility, and that could be better regulated, those systems of movement and mobility. But what you don't want to do is let it to slip into those situations of permanent exploitation. And anyway, Nepal has very clear laws about slavery and human trafficking, very clear laws. And not only that, but every country in the world has a clear law. And then not only that, but the international law is clear that the international laws on slavery trump all national laws. They're called Jus-Kogan laws, which means, like genocide, you can't do it anywhere ever. Yeah.
Well, I wasn't like advocating for slavery.
I didn't think you were.
I just formulated my question in the wrong way. So like I agree what you just said. Like actually I was going to that question, but you answered it.
Okay, good. I'm glad we understood each other perfectly. Yes, ma'am.
Given that your institution is located in the UK, has your research done anything looking at actual benefits of the UK Modern Slavery Act?
Benefits of that?
Yeah, like if you've been able to quantify whether it's slavery is applied or.
Yes. Oh, she's asking about the 2015 Modern Slavery Act, which we passed a law in 2015, which included fundamentally a replication of a law that we worked on as well with California, which was the California Slavery and Supply Chains Transparency Act, which said that requires all large companies to make a report about what they're doing every year to eradicate slavery from their supply chain. We had to explain that bit. So that then became national law in the UK as of 2016, early 2016. And the question is, are we finding it makes a difference? Are we measuring it and finding it makes a difference? The simple answer is yes. The data are not as robust as you might think, because for one thing, there's, I think, 20-some thousand companies that should be reporting, but only about half of them currently are reporting. So they're still moving through this process of learning their own obligation, their own legal obligations. But we certainly know that companies are much more aware. The most important thing about that law, and the one in California as well, wasn't to make them report. It was really to level the playing field across all companies. Previous to that, any company that discovered that they had trafficking or slavery in their supply chain, if they put their head above the parapet and said, oh my gosh, we found a problem in our supply chain, we really want to do something about it, our ice cream shouldn't have this, we're ashamed and we're going to fix it, the next day in the newspaper it would say, Dairy Queen kills children in slave fields of milk production, who knows what, right? It was like any company that was isolated would be taken down and attacked and have a reputation problem. And when you ask all companies to report in a uniform way, it creates a level playing field, which makes it safer for them to look closely and not be terrified to look at their own supply chains. And what we've seen is lots of companies doing the right thing. But I'll tell you an anecdote which also illustrates the power of these. So after the California law was passed, which was quite a few years ago now, I heard from this dairy farmer in rural Somerset, England. And he was a small farmer who made a bespoke kind of cheddar cheese. And he received a letter from California saying, we have to determine if there is any slavery in our supply chain, and since you supply your special cheddar cheese to our chain of delicatessens, can you please tell us about any risk of slavery on your dairy farm? And he's running this little dairy farm in rural Somerset, and he came to us to say, I don't understand what this is about. I mean, surely cows aren't slaves, right? I mean, not my cows. I love my cows, right? And we explained to him, no, they're obligated to ask anyone who supplies them. But all of a sudden he says, oh, so there's a thing called trafficking and slavery in supply chains. How interesting. I mean, it had this powerful spreading of intellectual information, even to the rural dairy farmers. Given, hold on, let's hear from Tom.
Can you just tell them about the degree program that you're offering?
No. No. Well, she's being very kind. One of the things that we learned looking at data not that long ago was that the amount of money flowing into anti-slavery work around the world is starting to curve upward like this, a steeper curve. And we also then charted against the financial resources coming into anti-slavery, anti-trafficking work, the human resources available to do that work. And we realized there was a discrepancy, that the human resource of trained people who know how to work in trafficking and slavery was not keeping up with the amount of jobs that were going to be created to do so. So we created an online master's degree, which is a professional degree, which is called the MA in Slavery and Liberation. And you can do it from anywhere in the world, and it trains you to take up those kinds of jobs. And you learn from a lot of the teachers on it are not academics like myself, but people who do the work on the ground day to day all over the world, working with people who are in trafficking and slavery, running the programs, designing the programs and interventions that get them free. So that's the degree that's on offer. And it's called MA, Slavery and Liberation. So if you want to look at it, that's fine. Now, when do we need to stop? Soon?
8 minutes.
8 minutes. Yes, and then we'll give us the last word or something.
Can you rationalize?
Can I rationalize? Oh, yeah. What? Oh, sorry.
The data that said the value of a slave from $40,000 in 1840 is down to $90,000.
Oh, can I explain it?
$90.
$90, yeah.
Yet,
You mean how did that happen?
my head is jumbled by the fact that the value of human life has been degraded to $90,
Mm-hmm.
and yet we are at a lower percentage of our population being exploited than ever.
I know, you'd think if they're so cheap, why don't we all get one, right? But we don't do that. Well, I don't know, you look like that kind of guy. I don't. No. I'm sorry. Shall I open that up a little bit, though, without making fun of you? Okay. I mean, there's a couple of things going on here. The fundamental thing, the first point is supply and demand, right? For almost all of human history, the supply of enslavable people was not great. You had to climb a mountain with weapons, mount a military operation to bring a few people in. You had to go across the ocean with a ship and get people from Africa over here and take them 1,000 miles. I mean, the cost of acquiring people, not just buying them in the market, that's just a marker of the cost of the acquisition and transport costs, was high for most of human history. It went up and down. There were times in the Roman Empire when an enormous military conquest would flood the markets and the prices would fall. But for the most part, it stayed up around that level. But when the population took off, the global population took off, right around the time I was born. When I was born, there were 2.5 billion people on the planet. Now there are 7.6 billion on the planet. It took us, say, 1 million years to reach 2.5 billion, and now in just my lifetime, it's gone from, it's nearly tripled, right? Now nothing like that has happened in the entire history of our planet, right? Even all the way back to the volcanoes and everything. Nothing like that has ever happened. But in human terms, it's fundamentally created a glut on the market. And the interesting thing to me, which addresses exactly what you're saying, though, is you could ask, well, how many are in that glut which are imminently enslavable, right? Because there's a billion people over here and a billion people over there who are actually like too rich, too powerful, living with too much law, good law enforcement, that they're going to end up in slavery. But in fact, if you look around the world and you say, okay, who's really in the pot of enslavability? Poor, conflict-ridden, all those sorts of things. The answer is about 600 to 700 million, maybe 800 million. And in a sense, again, it becomes a good news story in a weird way when you say there are about 700 million highly potential slaves, people who could not protect themselves from being trafficked or not protect themselves from being gathered up, but only 40 million in the world that are in that space. But part of that is also to do with all the other, drivers of the Anthropocene, in the sense that once you mechanize cotton, you don't need 100 people to cut to bring in the crop. You need 4. 2 to drive the combines, 2 to drive the trucks. I mean, it works like that. There are not that many spaces where people really need the basic, fundamental, simple, physical labor that people who are enslaved normally provide. Some of the first groups that we worked with in northern India, where they were in hereditary slavery in a quarry, a village in northern India, in hereditary slavery in a quarry, their job was to make sand with hammers. Sand. Out of sandstone. Now, sand is ubiquitous. Sand lies around on beaches. There's no way you could make sand in a way that would be economically viable if you had to pay the labor, right? Well, that's the type of work that most people in the world who are caught up in enslavement do, or some of those very fundamental biological things that are highly simple, like being raped or commercial sexual exploitation, right? And happily, the market for that, maybe it's more or maybe it's less than what it used to be, I don't know, but it seems to be what it is, and it's not 800 million, I don't think. But that's a different question we don't know the answer to. Does that help at all? Sure. Okay. Is that my 8 minutes up?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, did you want to say anything, Gibbon?
I had a question, but I think you covered it.
I did? Okay. Well, then there's one in the back. Be quick.
Are there other types of slavery sites that you could identify in the space aside from
Yes.
Is the short answer.
We're starting to find them more and more. We haven't drilled down as much as we want to yet, but one of the next places we're going, and I had a slide but I didn't put it in, are gold mines in Ghana. You can look at satellite imagery and tell a legal mine from an illegal mine very easily. and the illegal mines are very likely to be using enslaved workers for gold in Ghana, yeah. And it just has to do with how much equipment and stuff like that. Mining is really an easy one. Deforestation, illegal deforestation is another thing we look at. You know, if you're looking at the Virunga forest in East Africa, which has been preserved for all eternity in 1936, and you see a big hole in it, you know something's gone wrong, right? Because it's not supposed to be touched. I mean, if you just study the world's forests, which are under absolute preservation, like Yellowstone, and you see sudden ripping apart, you know something's gone horribly wrong there. And in most of the world, especially around the equator, if you see something horribly wrong in one of those forests, it's almost certainly about forced labor in deforestation, yeah. Is an example. Yeah.
What's your last word for students?
Last word for students? Well, in fact, we worked out a little plan earlier, talking with some students. We were thinking about, because students were asking me, so what is it we should do? What should we do right here at TCU? And I said, well, you know, or just earlier in the sessions that you organized, thank you, Vanessa, we were talking about how people right here come out of trafficking, are helped out of trafficking. They want to restart their lives. They want to get back on the ladder. They've had all of their productivity stolen from them and a lot of their health stolen from them for who knows how, months, if not years. And what they'd really like to do is just get back into school and learn the skills to move on with their lives. And yet, there are no scholarship programs for survivors of trafficking. And I thought, oh, this place has scholarships, right? So we decided you would organize a football camp that trains survivors, right? Because you and Noel, you know, he knows how to, right? And then once you get the survivors really, no, obviously I'm making a joke. But the point is, who knows how many scholarships this university has in its pocket? And of course, when we say scholarship, you don't actually even mean you give them money, just don't take their fees, take like their tuition. Why not a couple of tuition scholarships set aside every year for survivors of slavery? And why not name them? Why not name them after people who have done great things for the university? And then open it up so that, you know, when Given opens his 42nd dental hygiene clinic, right, and is rolling in the dough, he can endow the Given Kachepa Scholarship, right? Or whatever. I'm picking on Given, but you know. But so that you could have, you know, because who wouldn't want to have their name associated with a scholarship that was doing so much good as that? Why not students help survivors to become students? That's my last word. Okay.
Wasn't that great? He's doing really remarkable work, and my sort of, I guess, encouragement to all of you is that, as he said, you know, Dr. Bales has been doing this work for several decades now, and yet we're still really very much on the cutting edge of the work that has yet to be done. And so there's still much to do, and I encourage all of you to read as much as possible, seek out folks that you're interested in learning more from, and if you're interested in this subject, in this topic, I would encourage you to look at the MA program. There's still very much a lot to be done. Thank you so much for coming tonight, and let's just give Dr. Bales one more warm round of applause.